All right, so welcome to this certification talk. This certification talk is an exam cram on the AZ-500 Azure Security Engineer Associate exam. I want to thank everybody who's attending and anybody else who might be watching this recording. This is being recorded and will be out on our website here in the next week or two as well. So anybody can view this, but thank you for those of you who are attending. My name is Dwayne Natwick, and I am an Azure MVP, a Microsoft certified trainer and regional lead for that program, as well as a cloud training architect lead here at Opsgility. I have multiple years experience in the IT industry, as well as multiple Microsoft certifications, including the Azure Security Engineer exam, or the AZ-500. So today we're going to cover a few things. We're going to cover the exam, go over an overview of the exam. We're going to talk real briefly about some data challenges as we move into the different objectives of the exam, such as the identity and access objective, platform protection, data and application security, and security operations. Let's go into an exam overview, and we'll talk a little bit about more of those objectives here in a moment. The Azure Security Engineer and who that is somebody that understands the security best practices and industry security requirements that go around defense in depth, least privilege, role-based access control, multi-factor authentication, shared responsibility, zero trust. All of those best practices go into the security engineer role, and how then you're going to protect and secure networks and data and identities and personal information within your organization, and how you put into place the controls that are needed when deploying resources within the Azure environment. And that goes along with both Windows and Linux operating systems, platform services, and as well as storage accounts and other services that we'll talk more about as well. So the exam is made up of 4 objective areas, as I stated in the introduction slide, and they're all weighted differently based on Microsoft's weighted objective areas. And the way to look at these is, when you think about managed identity and access and it being 20 to 25%, is that if you have a 50-question test, you might have 10 to 15 questions that are around managed identity. And platform protection, close to half the exam is going to possibly be around platform protection. But the way to understand this is that they do, to a degree, overlap with each other. In a lot of cases, your platform protection question may have an identity and access answer, if you think of it that way. Same thing with security operations. You may be talking about different operations in terms of security, but those security operations are around a platform like a database or a storage account. So keep that in mind. Don't take this as the most important thing to know around the exam. It's just important to know the different objective areas. And platform protection has probably the most services built into that objective area, where managed identity and access, as you'll see in a moment, there's it's all around Azure Active Directory for the most part, and users and groups and how you're securing them. So the number of services don't equate to the number of questions that you might have, because you're going to probably have a lot of questions that are around managed identity and access, even if it is around a particular platform. And once you pass the Azure AZ-500 exam for the Azure Security Engineer Associate, you will earn your associate badge and be recognized as a Microsoft certified Azure Security Engineer Associate. So you only have to take the one exam to do that. I always recommend with somebody who's going after their first certification to still look at potentially taking the Azure Fundamentals exam first, because the AZ-900 exam gives you a good foundational level around all of the services within the Azure environment, and gives you a good understanding of that even before you dive into how you're going to secure them. But it's not a requirement. Those are optional. So if you've been around the Azure environment a little bit already, you can still understand the the services around the objectives of this exam. So let's get into objective 1, identity and access. And the first thing, just to think about and to understand as we go around this is that there's a lot of different types of threats and vulnerabilities out there within the organization. And all of these objectives take into account how we protect all of these. And we'll talk more about defense in depth and shared responsibility and things as part of this review. But understanding, that we're thinking about not only our external threats and bad actors, but we're also thinking about potential internal threats or internal user mistakes that might cause some sort of level of compromise within our environment. And that's really where identity and access really helps out, and having a good plan and posture around how you're securing identities within your organization is going to help you out. And there's a few different topics that we're going to review here within identity and access. Azure Active Directory is the main umbrella around it all, but there's also Azure Active Directory identity protection. There's talking about enterprise governance. There's privileged identity management, and there's hybrid identity. And we'll talk a little bit here at the start around what we're talking about around hybrid identity, but then we'll get into how we create that hybrid identity approach within our organization. So what Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's multi-tenant cloud-based directory and identity management service. It is a cloud-based service. It's utilized for your cloud-based identities. When you get an Azure subscription or Microsoft 365 subscription, Dynamics 365, Power Platform, those all Teams, those are all part of the Azure Active Directory tenant, and those are all then services that you authenticate to utilizing Azure Active Directory. As well as many other third-party cloud services are also within there that you can utilize. It is not Active Directory domain services. So if you're somebody that's been around an on-premises environment and Active Directory for a long time, Azure Active Directory is not it at all. So when you say Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory isn't even part of that conversation. We'll talk about in a moment why. But there are some capabilities between the two to integrate the two together, which we'll talk about when we get to hybrid identity and how that works. There are a lot of capabilities and integration that we can do, as well as providing single sign-on access. Important to understand that there are hundreds of built-in roles within Azure Active Directory. You can create custom roles as well. The key things to understand is what some of these roles are, and the two key ones around what a security administrator or security engineer is going to worry about is what a global administrator is, which ultimately when you create your tenant, you are going to create a global administrator, and you're going to utilize that global administrator for all features and functionality. It's important to have a couple global administrators in case somebody is to leave the company, and then there's somebody left that can remove that person as the global administrator. But it's also recommended that you have no more than 4 global administrators within your tenant, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about privileged access. Security administrators, it's probably the role for the most part that a security engineer or somebody that's involved in security operations should have, because you have then the permissions across all security related features within the Azure and Microsoft 365 environment. So those are 2 very important administrator level roles that you need to think about in terms of Azure Active Directory. A couple other ones of note are the directory reader, which can make purchases and manage the subscription, create support tickets and things of that nature. And then the global reader has the ability, and it's kind of a management level or that C-level type person that wants to be able to look and see what's going on in the environment and review settings and administrative information across both Microsoft 365 services and Azure services. Just keep those in mind, and just to understand that there's different things, different controls and capabilities around an administrator or a reader, and we didn't even talk about operators as well. So this goes a little bit deeper into the differences between Azure Active Directory and Active Directory themselves. Active Directory, again, is the on-premises environment. The on-premises Windows Server Active Directory, you have a server there that's your domain controller. You might have multiple domain controllers. Then you have Azure Active Directory on the other side of the slide here, which is utilizing and helping for authentication and accessing cloud services, whether it's Azure resources, apps within the Azure catalog, and Microsoft 365 applications, Dynamics 365, SharePoint Online, all of those. The key things around the key differences around here is around authentication and structure. Within Azure Active Directory, we're utilizing the open source authentication protocols of SAML, OAuth, WS Federation, where within the Active Directory environment, the Windows Server Active Directory has Kerberos and NTLM. So right there, you can see that there's a potential communication conflict already going on that we need to find some way to remediate if we are going to communicate as in a single sign-on type environment with our on-premises applications as well as our cloud applications. The structure, again, very flat structure with Azure Active Directory of just their tenants, where we have the forests, domains, organizational units, and all of that, and different domains within our organization, within our Active Directory that have access to different areas within our organization and things of that nature. Again, you can see there that there's a level of conflict there, where if we're trying to coordinate a seamless user environment, we might have problems. Active Directory, generally you're going to be creating users and groups within the environment, and those users or service as well as service principals for applications and whatnot are created, and then they can be assigned to different groups. There's two different group types to understand. There's security groups and Office 365 groups. In most cases, you can create a security group for anything if you want to. If you have services or users that are not going to be utilizing or authenticating to any resources within Azure, you can put them on Office 365 groups if they're just using those SaaS-based services. That is not a problem. Key differences are you have your assigned and dynamic users that can be utilized in both security and Office 365 groups. But if you want to assign dynamic devices through Intune to a group of devices, those devices could only join to a security group. You can only use those dynamic devices with security groups. So that's important to understand there. That's the only place that you can utilize that dynamic device type assignment. Key thing to understand here around the dynamic capabilities, those, and I'll hit on these services as we go through, you require some level of premium license for the dynamic creation of groups. So understand that does not come with your base licensing. When you create any kind of tenant within Microsoft 365 or Azure, you do get Azure Active Directory by default, and you can set up users and groups. You just don't have the dynamic capabilities without utilizing the higher level premium licensing. And it's going to be the same as we go about and talk about some of these higher level identity security features as well here in this section. Multi-factor authentication is super important to an organization, and again, to point out is that you will get multi-factor authentication for your administrative accounts with your basic license when you sign up for Azure services or Microsoft 365 services to assign them down to at the user level, you need to have a premium or paid level license. Things to understand around the authentication of a multi-factor authenticated setup is you need 2 factors of authentication, hence multi-factor. Generally, that starts with a password, and passwords are inherently volatile and easy to, and generally the most compromised area of your organization. And so having that second level of authentication can help to alleviate some of that. And what you utilize for that is something you have, such as a device that has an authenticator app, or that you can receive a phone call or a text message to, and then something you are, like a biometric feature, like facial recognition or fingerprint reading, utilizing those to access your accounts and to provide that second level of that you are who you say you are. So let's pause now and have a couple of questions here, and before we move on. And the first question is, Azure Active Directory does not use which of the following security protocols? So there's 5 listed here. 4 of them are utilized by Azure Active Directory. 1 of them is not. So I'll pause for a moment here. The answer here is Kerberos. So if you remember, we talked about on the slide of the differences between Azure Active Directory and Windows Server Active Directory. And Windows Server Active Directory utilizes Kerberos and NTLM. Azure Active Directory utilizes those open source industry protocols that are listed B through E here. Next question, your organization is considering multi-factor authentication. Your manager asks about a secondary verification method, and which of the following is not one of those secondary verification methods? Which one is not valid for Azure MFA? Is it an automated phone call, an email link with a verification code, the Microsoft Authenticator app with OAuth verification code, push notification to the phone, or a text message with an authentication code? Hopefully everybody said B. That was the one that I did not mention when we were going through that slide here a moment ago. Emailed verification codes are generally utilized for self-service password reset capabilities, where you're trying to recover your password. It's emailed to a personal email address, but it is not a multi-factor authentication verification method. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about through the test, that is not one of those methods. It's usually something that's a little bit more on demand than an email. The email could then, somebody could gain access to your email. It's a lot harder to gain access to hearing a phone call or a text message coming to you. So that's why the authentication code on your text message is one thing there. The push notifications and the Authenticator app, those are probably the best methods, as well as a phone call, because those are real time, and the Authenticator and push notifications, those codes and those capabilities expire as well. So those are very helpful. So let's go into a little bit around advanced identity protection features. Again, this is a premium level feature where we now have the capability to utilize Microsoft's machine learning capabilities on the back end and review and utilize automated detection capabilities around risks within the identity. And again, we have many external risks and we have internal risks, and identity a lot of times is an internal risk where users just don't know what they don't know and don't always think about how to protect themselves and how to avoid potential bad actors from the external. There may be a combination of internal and external threat that creates this user risk, this level of risk. And there's two types of risks that we look at within identity protection. That's user risk and sign-in risk. And we can set up different levels and what kind of enforcement, and we'll talk about some of those enforcements when we get to conditional access policies. But having identity protection in place gives us that next level of premium features for understanding potential risky users based on just their typical behaviors, or maybe even finding atypical behaviors for them, understanding what their typical day is and evaluating what their typical day is, and also recognizing then that, hey, they've deviated from that typical day. Those are some key things that identity protection helps us with as a security practitioner to understand and to determine what we need to do then to protect our organization. And there's different risk levels and risk events that we can think about that are some of those suspicious actions. You know, we might feel that there might be some leaked credentials because we're seeing some weird sign-ins taking place, anonymous IP addresses, impossible travel. Somebody signed in from Michigan in the United States, and then 15 minutes later signed in Seattle or in the UK. That's impossible. That's not capable unless they're bouncing off a bunch of servers. But again, something to be alerted on. Sign in from unfamiliar locations. Like I said, different behaviors being understood of what typical behavior is, and then, hey, this person doesn't usually sign in from here. Now they might be on vacation, but still, it's something that the system is going to understand that we might need to look at this, you know, and it could alert you on it that if this is like higher than a low level threat, that we might want to take a deeper look, get alerted on it, and then go on from there. Potentially, if it's a managed device, that device might be infected, or different IP addresses that are in suspicious activity areas as well. And then we could set different policies up on what we're going to do in terms of allowing or blocking those capabilities. We can do this as well with conditional access policies, but we can do this directly within information protection as well. And usually what you want to do at some level is at least require multi-factor authentication. If it's something that's a very highly secure and highly confidential application, we might just want to block access until we can do some more investigation, but that might cause an issue with the user not having access to that application and being able to do their job. So first, at a base level though, if there's a level of risk that's considered high or maybe even medium, depending on the number of events that we're seeing, we might still just allow that access to happen, but they're going to have to use multi-factor authentication. Important thing to know here is that these users that are on this risk level have to also then be enrolled in multi-factor authentication to give them that option. So if they've never signed up for multi-factor authentication, they're going to have to provide that information and get enrolled into MFA before that can take place. And as I've said a couple times, conditional access policies are ways for these organizations then to utilize these different signals that we were talking about in terms of real-time risk capabilities, as well as other things around location, devices, applications, and then determine what we're going to do, whether it's just straight allowing access, which probably isn't in most cases recommended, unless that signal is this is from a specific corporate headquarters location, then we just allow them access, we block all other access. Generally, you're going to see most of these conditional access policies are going to say, okay, if this happens, then I'm going to require multi-factor authentication and then give them access. Again, if it's a highly secure, highly confidential type application, we might just block access entirely. And this just kind of takes it a step further in terms of how we're going to allow that access and when that condition happens, what that condition does. And another thing that we can do and put in place regarding organizations is with privileged users and with elevated roles within our organization, we could do access reviews. And again, this could be done with multiple types of users. It could be done that we've got guest users that are on our tenant for specific projects. We can to recertify that they still need that access, different applications that may have fluctuation in access required, as well as then privileged role assignments. We'll talk about privileged identity management here in a moment. This is premium capabilities that we need to have. You need to be a global admin or a user admin to put these access reviews in place, but it can evaluate then and track and audit on these types of applications that might be at risk, or just avoid any types of issues by having somebody on our tenant or having somebody with administrative rights for too long. And around identity and around the entire organization of a cloud environment, and we talk about this at the fundamentals level as well, it's important to understand how shared responsibility works. And when we're talking about identity and the identity infrastructure and the information and data, we have a certain level of responsibility, and the customer always retains the requirements of protecting your data, protecting your devices, and protecting your accounts and identities. So when we're talking about identity and access management, there's a level of directory infrastructure that Microsoft provides to you, the organization, but you have to put it in place. You have to turn it on. You have to buy those premium licenses to give you information protection or privileged identity management or conditional access capabilities or multi-factor authentication. Having those all in place and utilizing those is your responsibility to take that into account. One of the great things around Microsoft and Azure and Microsoft 365 is what they give you in terms of controls. And you can see that you get a certain level of control that is the responsibility of Microsoft when you get into platform services, and we'll talk about platform protection in the next objective area. But even where in an infrastructure as a service type level, you're fully responsible for those capabilities. There are still some capabilities within Microsoft that you can turn on around operating systems and network controls and applications, which again we'll talk about in the next objective. There are security capabilities that you have at your disposal within the Azure environment. So even though we see a lot of blue here in IaaS, and we see half and half here in PaaS type services, the capabilities there for both your Azure infrastructure as well as your on-premises infrastructure is there within the Azure environment and can be turned on. But that's really what it comes down to, is what do you have to turn on within this middle section in the model, and what do you have to look at to do that in terms of your applications and networks and all of that. Really, at the SaaS level, Microsoft's taking care of that whole built-in area. But again, if you're buying Microsoft 365 services with just the standard licensing, you don't get things like data protection services and cloud app security and conditional access capabilities, privileged identity management. You don't get those capabilities without turning them on and without purchasing a higher level, a premium level subscription. Azure policy is very helpful for governing those environments, and I'm not going to hit on this at really deeply, but understanding what it does, and I'll actually probably go into the portal here real quick just for you to understand what you can do. But you can create policies or create initiatives, which is a group of policies, and put those together for different governing in your environment. And there's some examples on the right here of ways that you can govern your environment from a cost standpoint, as well as a data sovereignty standpoint, as well as a security standpoint in terms of Azure backup. You know, allowed virtual machine SKUs could help you govern your cost structure. Allowed locations can make sure that you're not creating resources outside of your governing country and things of that nature. So, and if we go into Azure here and go into the Azure portal, I can go into my policies. I got a search saved right here, and can choose policy here. And you can see I have some policies already in place here. I have some initiatives in place as well. You generally have this Azure Security Center subscription comes with your subscription, and then you have some as the default, and then you have your Defender subscription, and we'll talk about that when we get to Azure Security Center in terms of operations. But if we go here to our definitions, we can review here our policies and our initiatives, and you can see the way that the built-in policies and initiatives are done. At the top, you get the initiatives, which are a group of policies, and you see how many policies make up that definition. And then beyond there are our built-in policies, and we can see and can very easily filter here of, you know, by location, and can see allowed locations here, and can put that policy in place for specific locations on specific resource groups. So if we have, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about data sovereignty, when we talk about storage and databases, but we have our capability here to say, okay, I have a US resource group, I have a European resource group, I have a Asian resource group, and the US resource group can only create resources within the US regions, and we can select all of those regions. Same thing with Europe, we can select the European regions. Asia, we can select the Asian regions. And then if anybody tries to deviate from that, it is not going to get verified, and it's going to get blocked. Role-based access control is a little bit step further than Azure AD roles. They're a little bit different there, where Azure AD roles are at the tenant level, and Azure role-based access control roles are at the more at the group and resource level. So, so once you get into more into the subscription level, you're going to set up those identity and access management roles, or role-based access control roles for your resource groups, your subscription, your resources, and all of that. You know, you may in some cases utilize Azure Active Directory roles and instead of role-based access control roles, but role-based access control roles can get much more granular with your resources down to the resource level and what they're going to do. And the typical roles within there are the owner, the contributor, the reader, and then user access administrator. Important to understand what each of these are and what each of these do. Our owner is almost like the global administrator of that particular resource. They can do they can manage everything within the resource, as well as delegate somebody their own role within that resource or that subscription or whatever. Contributor can manage, can create, can do everything except for assign a role to somebody else. Reader can only review, as is reader in Azure Active Directory roles, and then user access administrator has the ability to delegate access as well, but they can't create any resources. So the owner does essentially the contributor and the user access administrator role all in one. And those work, you know, when we look, you know, this course and the certification kind of lumps role-based access control and policies together. They're really two different things, where role-based access controls are the users and the roles that they have to access services, where the policies are conditions and effects on the resources as well. So both of them work hand in hand in terms of how you access and how resources are created within your environment. But they're really two distinctly different things, but just important to understand that as well. So let's jump into some more questions here. So you have 3 virtual machines. It's VM1, VM2, and VM3, and they're all in a resource group. Help desk hires a new employee, and that employee must be able to modify VM3, but not VM1 and 2. Your solution must minimize your administrative overhead. So what should you do? And I'll give you a moment here on that one. And I'll read the answers here for everybody. That'd be assign the user the contributor role on the resource group, assign them the contributor role on VM3, move VM3 to a new resource group and assign the user to contributor on VM3, or assign the user the contributor role in the resource group, then assign the user the owner role on VM3. All right. And the answer is assign the user the contributor role on VM3. As I stated when I was talking about role-based access control, it gets very granular all the way down to the specific resource, not just the service itself of virtual machines. Granted, you could create a virtual machine contributor on the resource group, which is what A would really do, and that would give them the rights to make changes to VM1, VM2, and VM3. We could create a new resource group just for VM3 and move VM3 to it, but that'd be a big pain. We might have to do more networking if VM3 communicates with VM1 and VM2. That, from an administrative overhead standpoint, that does not minimize our administrative overhead. Again, on D again, we don't want to create an owner role at VM3. There's no reason for that because we don't want them to be able to give another employee access rights, which was what an owner would do. They need the contributor role, and you should recognize that first and foremost that they needed the contributor role. So that would eliminate D right away. You ultimately, so in this situation, you can B and C gets us to what the first level of requirements are in terms of only having access to VM3, but the minimizing administrative overhead removes C. So just to understand how this all works and how that role-based access control works and really how the questioning works within Microsoft exams, this is a really, really good example of how to read the whole question before you answer it. All right, resource locks. This is a little bit different than role-based access control, where we're saying at this resource level you can do this and do that. This actually says, okay, I've got a resource that I don't that at some level I don't want any changes. What then how do I lock that down? And resource locks are a very easy way to do that, to say, you know what, I don't want anybody changing this. This is too important of an application. If somebody gets in and just makes one little adjustment, it's going to break the whole thing. How do I keep that from happening? I can go into that resource, put a read only on there, and then nobody can do anything to it. Now that doesn't mean that they can't, if it's a virtual machine, that they can't RDP into that virtual machine and get into that virtual machine. It's at the portal and like PowerShell level, you can't do anything. But if you just want to make sure that nobody deletes it, that certain changes are necessary once in a while to make certain tweaks to that resource, we can put a delete lock on there, which is actually a do not delete lock, to avoid somebody just accidentally deleting that resource. So read only, and just understand read only is the most restrictive of the two, because if you have read only on there, you can't make any changes and you can't delete it. With a delete lock or do not delete lock, it's delete when you select it, but it's really do not delete. Then that's the only thing you can't do, is delete it. You can go in and make adjustments to it if necessary. Keep losing my mouse, sorry. All right, let's go into zero trust model and talk a little bit about what that is. Zero trust model, and what it does is it assumes that somebody's compromised or that a breach happened is really what it comes down to, and requires constant verification of those users. It's very important from a standpoint of a cloud-based services level. I can give you a very strong example that just happened yesterday. Was I started getting emails in the morning that somebody had changed my son's Comcast account, had changed his password. I go in and take care of that. Somebody had gone in actually and created a new, put a new secondary email address, and a phone number. So they had compromised his password and then put their second level verification contact information in there. I went, luckily I have administrative rights to his account being a child on my account. So I was able to go in under my account and get to his user account and make those changes. Otherwise he would have been completely locked out of his account. Made those changes, put proper verification in there, put multi-factor authentication with the Xfinity Authenticator app to make sure that if this person tried to go back into that account, that the notification was going to go to a cell phone in my household rather than his cell phone or her cell phone. Not sure who the perpetrator is. And then later on in the day, I get an email into my email address again that his Microsoft account has also been compromised. It has also had its password changed. Again, went into my Microsoft tenant, got his password recovered, put the Authenticator app on the same phone, and got that recovered as well. Find out later on, he gets home from school, his Fortnite account has been completely stolen. He can't even get to his account. Finds out utilizing Fortnite Tracker when he puts his username in that somebody had gone in, changed his username, changed the email on the account, stole all of his stuff. So first, number one cybersecurity threat, or cybersecurity theft. So he had to go in, and so we spent a good portion of last night going back and forth with support at Epic Games to get that fixed and get that recovered. And long story short, by this morning, he had all his stuff back, had it all back on his email. I now have Fortnite's authentication on his Microsoft Authenticator app as well, so that he does not, hopefully does not compromise that as well. Had the password, instead of utilizing something he can remember, had it auto-generated so that nobody's going to be able to, knock on wood, hack that account again. But that was a fun, 10 or so hours yesterday of doing some cybersecurity investigation and remediation. So the zero trust model takes that. To get back on track here around zero trust model, is zero trust model does that. It takes that into account and says that everybody's a threat, everything's a breach. What are you going to do? What are how are you going to prove to me that you are who you say you are? And we do that through utilizing multi-factor authentication as a foundation, but also can then also create different conditions then that, and utilize different services around Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Intune that can recognize what conditions that user is working under, in terms of a device, where they are, who they are, what their risk level is, and then any exceptions that, hey, this person is a trusted administrator, it's an administrator account, we can't lock out. What are we going to do there? And then again, like conditional access policies or those user risk policies, we can then allow access or block access, and we can allow that access and on many different levels based on whether they have multi-factor authentication, whether they're joined to the domain, whether they have device management such as Intune on there, and even make them change their password as well as utilize multi-factor authentication as well. And that takes us down a path here of, privileged identity and where we are now in terms of the evolution of identity management. We've talked in different ways around identity protection, understanding risk, and understanding and utilizing multi-factor authentication and what that zero trust is. And around that zero trust, ultimately we want to get away from passwords. Why we're so reliant on passwords, and passwords are such a security risk within our organization. We just beat our head against the wall about losing access to our resources because somebody has stolen our password. And that's really where we are here with that evolution here, where traditionally we had our on-premises environment where we had our desktop, we were on a wire, we accessed our apps that were within our building, and there was no visibility to our identity because it was all self-contained within a building. Then we started moving to all this cloud identity. We have I haven't counted, but I would imagine I probably have hundreds of different cloud identities out there on different services that I utilize. When I was looking at my son's account and looking at what he had in terms of logins on his browser, he had a couple dozen just, and he's 11. We're gaining more and more of these cloud identities, and as we gain these cloud identities and rely on passwords, the more risk we have to exposing those, and the more that we're using the same password over and over again, the more of our services that are going to be threatened and possibly breached. So optimally, we would love to get away from passwords. Let's get to passwordless authentication. Authenticator app is one of those ways. Utilizing biometrics, definitely. Multi-factor authentication is one of those those pieces that is the most important piece, the first step to passwordless as we're going there. But using our devices and all of our behaviors to determine how we're going to log in and what we're going to do, what level, where we're going to go in terms of, we're going to require more than a password. We need at least another factor of authentication. Okay, that one's not good enough, or okay, you're on your personal laptop. I know that's your personal laptop. We're going to use Windows Hello facial recognition, and you're going to gain access through biometrics rather than putting a password in, because that way I can really verify it's you. So that's, those are some areas, that passwordless, using the Authenticator app and Windows Hello for Business are probably your first forays into passwordless type authentication being enabled. And privileged access, privileged identity management is part of that zero trust model of I'm going to not trust you, and I'm also not going to give you full administrator rights all the time anymore. You're going to get the administrator rights you need when you need them, and they're going to be for the time that you need them, and they're going to expire when you don't need them. And that's really what privileged identity management is. It's time-based, it's approval-based, it's audited, so everybody who has been given those rights, why they were given those rights, and for how long, so that if there is a breach somewhere within that time frame, you can very easily target and trigger figure out who that was in investigation. And privileged identity management works alongside those access reviews we were talking about here a short time ago, where we do those access reviews on a regular basis to make sure that they still need those roles assigned to them. Maybe they've changed jobs, they've changed positions within the company, and they no longer need to have that level of administration at any time, and we can remove them as even being assigned that role at any time, and give that to somebody else if necessary, or just leave that open for now. But if they're assigned that role, they can request that access through a request, and it can be denied as well if we find, oh, that person's changed their role, why are they asking for access? And here's the workflow that privileged identity management goes through. You ultimately, whenever you're thinking about any identity plan, identity and access management plan, or security plan, planning is the key, and thinking about how you're going to go about it, then how you're going to assign it. Once they're assigned, then the user then approves, or the user then asks to have it activated, and then there's an approver level that then approves it. They view that, okay, this person does need this for a couple hours to do their task, and they can approve it. And then it's again constantly audited so that they know when somebody's had this activated, when it was when it moved from activated to back to assigned. And then there's those access reviews then to review that they still need this assigned to them as well. So let's go back to a knowledge check here. Your compliance auditors want to ensure, as employees change jobs or leave the company, that their privileges are also changed or revoked. They're especially concerned about the administrator group. To address their concerns, you implement which of the following? Select one. Is it access reviews, Azure time-based policies, just-in-time virtual machine access, or is it management groups? I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a drink here. Hopefully everybody out there thought access reviews. We hit on that. This is, how we review and make sure that we're going through a process of just making sure that people need those roles that they were assigned, especially at the administrative level. You can also think of this at the guest level as well. If you have guest users that have certain access to different groups and different resources within our environment, we probably want to put them on access reviews as well. All right, let's talk about Azure AD Connect. I think this is the last topic really within this first objective here. So Azure AD Connect is that integrated integration with the on-premises Active Directory. As I stated, that Azure Active Directory and Active Directory are two completely different things. They're really far apart in terms of what they utilize for authentication methods and how they're structured. So how do we then utilize both within our environment? Azure AD Connect becomes that bridge between those two to coordinate that connection and that synchronization. There are three different ways that you can do that, and that's password hash synchronization, pass-through authentication, and Active Directory federation services. And I'll talk about each of these real quick here. Password hash is taking that password from the on-premises environment and synchronizing a hash password to Azure Active Directory. The benefit here is that it's probably the least administrative requirements in terms of setting it up. If you have a qualified domain on your on-premises Active Directory and that's verified on Azure Active Directory, you can very easily utilize this for both your on-premises identities and your cloud identities. And the beauty of this particular type of synchronization is if your Active Directory on-premises is cut off, disconnected from the environment, you can still sign into your cloud identities. The second is the pass-through authentication. Here, your on-premises Active Directory is your single source of truth. It is your means for accessing your resources and everything, whether it's your Microsoft 365 and cloud services or your on-premises services. They go through and go down to the on-premises AD to verify the identity. So a little bit more goes along with utilizing that, and you do have the capability for bringing in some other services, but there are some services that that you can utilize for other features like MFA and self-service password reset. You can put password write-backs in place to allow users to change their password at the Azure Active Directory level, and it writes it back down. So that allows some capabilities there in terms of cloud level authentication as well. But again, not as seamless. There's some more capabilities there where because you have to have a pass-through authentication agent that's on your devices and things of that nature. Federation is probably the most complex of the three, and this utilizes like web proxies at the on-premises location, and you have that, and you're creating that federated trust provider at on-premises to connect to Azure Active Directory. So there's a little bit more configuration and a little bit more software coordination that goes into place to create this federated identity type environment. Most enterprise level organizations probably are going to utilize this type of authentication method for organizations, because you need this for certain things like on-premises single sign-on and multi-factor authentication and things of that nature, especially if you have a third-party third-party MFA provider. Password write-back again allows then for users to change and utilize that self-service password reset at the Azure Active Directory level, and then write those passwords back down to on-premises. It's part of Azure Active Directory Connect, so it is something that when you configure it, it's a configuration option. So you don't have to then set up a self-service password reset capability within on-premises either. If you put this in place within the Azure Active Directory environment. So let's do another knowledge check here. Your IT help desk wants to reduce password reset support tickets. You suggest having users sign into both on-premises and cloud-based applications using the same password. The organization does not plan on using Azure Active Directory identity protection. So which feature would be easiest to implement given the requirement? This one would be pass-through authentication. We want to sign in to both. We're not using any identity protection at the Azure Active Directory level, so we need to set up a pass-through authentication so that they're only signing on at the on-premises level. So that way they can set up self-service password reset there. An option if they were going to utilize Azure Active Directory identity protection would be to set up some level of password write-back as well. So password write-back could be a feature in here, but what they're looking at here is that they're not planning on using those extra levels of Azure Active Directory for identity protection. So you need to put that pass-through authentication in place. Which tool can you use to synchronize Azure Active Directory passwords? There's a typo there, with on-premises Active Directory. So we're talking about Azure Active Directory passwords and on-premises Active Directory. Which tool can you use to synchronize? So we're talking about a tool here, and that tool to synchronize those passwords is password write-back. So we're going to put password write-back in place. So we're going to set password write-back and have that tool in place on our Azure Active Directory Connect service to communicate. That's a confusing question there, because it could be we're synchronizing our passwords with Azure AD Connect, but really when we're thinking about synchronizing passwords with Azure AD Connect, we think about going from on-premises Active Directory up to Azure Active Directory. That would be Azure AD Connect. To pull them back down, the tool we have to turn on is password writeback. All right, let's do another one here. Which of the following is not a passwordless authentication option that integrates with Azure Active Directory? We didn't go through all of these, but we can hopefully figure this out here. And we're talking about passwordless authentication. So an authentication that would not require a password to be used. So hopefully that helps you think about what the answer is here. And the answer would be multi-factor authentication, because if you remember, one of those factors is generally a password in multi-factor authentication, so therefore it's not passwordless. Having a security key is one. I've mentioned when we were talking about passwordless, I mentioned specifically the Authenticator app and Windows Hello for Business. The other one on here is that FIDO2 security keys. All right, we have gotten through objective 1, so we are we're 25% of the way there in terms of the objectives, but probably a little bit more than that, because that is a big section. I generally spend an entire day on that in class, so we spent about a little less than an hour, I think, on there. So let's go into platform protection. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about defense in depth. I've mentioned it, and here it is really in a diagram level. Physical security, here is within the cloud environment, we don't worry about physical security anymore because Microsoft's responsibility is that physical level of security. If we are looking at our on-premises environment, we do concern ourselves with physical security. Within identity and access, we have defense with our Azure Active Directory identity protection with conditional access policies. Putting in privileged identity management and utilizing those services are all ways to defend our identity and access. Role-based access control is another one. Now we'll get into some other of these services around perimeter, network, compute, applications, and data as we go through here. And we'll talk about some of these services here, like DDoS protection, Azure Firewall, network security groups, application security groups, host security, container security, advanced data security. We'll look at all of these at a high level here in a few minutes as we talk through now that platform level of protection, which really starts getting into that the compute and the networking levels. And we need to think, what we're talking about here and what we're protecting, especially around the perimeter. We're thinking, and the network level, we have different, rather than in our own environment, in our on-premises environment, we have, our network. We have our physically cabled network that's plugged into switch infrastructure and routing infrastructure and all of that within our environment. We have VLANs that are created to segment our environment and to utilizing IP addresses to segment those environments as well. We do very similar things within the cloud environment, within a virtual network. And because we don't have access to the physical hardware anymore, we have virtual switch fabrics and different dynamic and reserved public IP addresses. We have our own, in our virtual network, we have our own IP schema that we can set up within the environment however we want, based on IPv4, IPv6 type schemas. And then we have how we're providing virtual machine access, load balancing, DNS, traffic management, DDoS protection are all things we need to take into account. And like I said, bring your own network. We can utilize the same schema that we're utilizing on premises, continue that on, and provide those VPN connections to our on-site environment. We can utilize security groups to allow inbound and outbound traffic, and set up specific type routes within our environment as well. And then again, within our connection to our on-premises network, we do have capabilities of site-to-site, point to site for dev test or for users to access. Then we have site-to-site type VPN gateways, and then express routes that are highly private type connections. So distributed denial of service attacks, our denial of service attacks prevent access to services or systems. So when you purchase services within Azure, you get DDoS protection as a default. And because Microsoft does not want one of these attacks to take place in their environment, because it's going to affect more than just you as the tenant, it's going to affect multiple tenants. So they do have those capabilities and those security controls in place that will hopefully avoid a DDoS attack in your environment. What you can do in terms of a paid service within the environment is increase that so that you have the ability to view reports and put different policies in place that might be a little bit more custom to your environment and your environment needs. But as a standard, you do get basic DDoS protection as part of your subscription on your tenant. Azure Firewall provides another layer of perimeter type control where you can determine those trusted and untrusted environments and networks. And it is a stateful firewall. Key point here is it's got built-in high availability. It's integrated with Azure Monitor and supports different hybrid connectivities. You can create a gateway to on-premises firewalls to create that seamless connection and that point-to-point connection as well. Another thing that you can provide within the VPN connections and the routing of a VPN gateway connection to your from your Azure resources, your Azure VNets to on-premises is utilizing forced tunneling, which will actually redirect that traffic directly to the on-premises network, which is probably helpful if you need to authenticate at that level, not having to necessarily traverse directly through the Azure network, and to virtually just go directly to the on-premises network can provide also a level of security where you're not where somebody doesn't necessarily penetrate your Azure virtual network. And then we have as well user-defined routes where we can route have potentially a network virtual appliance. Maybe we're not utilizing Azure Firewall. We need to have a virtual Palo Alto or Cisco virtual appliance within our Azure environment. We can then utilize the user-defined routes to route that traffic directly to that appliance as our first level of access into our virtual network. So let's pause for another knowledge check. And so which of the following two features of Azure networking provide the ability to redirect all internet traffic back to your company's on-premises servers for packet inspection? And there are two options here. All right, hopefully you thought of forced tunneling and user-defined routes, which were really the only two that we mentioned here. So hopefully those pointed you to that. We talked about user-defined routes as far as routing to a virtual appliance within the Azure network. We could utilize those user-defined routes any way we want and can route that to on-premises traffic. Forced tunneling is specific for that routing directly to on-premises servers and networks. All right, your organization has a web application and is concerned about attacks that flood the network layer with a substantial amount of seemingly legitimate traffic. What should you do? All right, and this we're talking about DDoS attack. So we might have to create a DDoS policy. Now we as an organization, again, Microsoft provides you with a level of DDoS protection, but not within that can you create necessarily a DDoS policy. You might be able to, there might be a built-in policy to do something around that, but I think for the most part, creating this, working with DDoS at this level, you need to have that standard subscription. So you need to increase your subscription to accomplish this, and keep that in mind. Network security groups. So network security groups are different. They work very similarly from a standpoint of rules that like a firewall would do in terms of inbound and outbound traffic rules. That's what network security group does at its base level, and generally associates itself with a network interface card or a subnet. And it provides then default rules inbound and outbound. So it's just another layer of security that you can put in place like day one. There's no cost to a network security group. You can create as many as you want on your, you can create one for every virtual machine network card and associate it to that with different inbound and outbound rules with no cost. So you can start creating those rules, understanding how traffic's going to flow before turning on an Azure firewall resource and then moving those rules to there as well. There are some default rules, both inbound and outbound rules for the virtual traffic, and those rules are to block all inbound internet traffic, to allow all virtual network to virtual network traffic, both inbound and outbound, allow inbound load balancer traffic, and the other is, and we can go to network security groups to remember that, because I don't remember off the top of my head. Here we go. Deny all inbound traffic, virtual network to virtual network, and deny all outbound. So there's deny. That was what I was forgetting. Deny all outbound traffic. So those are your main ones, your main rules that you have by default. You can move those around. You can generally leave those in place, but then you create higher priority rules to allow more traffic to traverse within your network. Application security groups work at a higher level than ports and IP addresses like a network security group does. They work higher up the stack and can be utilized, again, very similarly to network security groups, but rather than working at the NIC level, they're working more at the application level. Service endpoints are another type of connection where it's more of a direct connection from one service to another across virtual networks, where a virtual machine might need access to a storage account or to a database. You can create that service endpoint, which makes it a little bit more secure rather than exposing the IP address of those resources. You can create that specific service endpoint, which is more based around a service principal within Azure Active Directory than it is a network defined route. And then private links can also be utilized very similarly to that, to a service endpoint. It can be utilized within the Azure environment to connect multiple tenants. It can be utilized even for on-premises, like a on-premises database connecting to an Azure platform database for seamless connection, and again, more of a private type connection with private authentication rather than exposing it to the internet. Application gateways are utilized as a way to route traffic for specific applications. You can put web application firewalls on that application gateway to protect traffic and protect against certain known threats like injection threats or spoofing attacks and things of that nature. It utilizes routing at the HTTPS level, and then protects resources against against having a whole bunch of public IP addresses exposed. Ultimately, what this main group here all does is it avoids the need to expose public IP addresses on the network cards of virtual machines and app services and databases and things. Web application firewall, like I said, can go off of it works as a part in conjunction with the application gateway. It also works with like Azure Front Door as well, where it protects against common threats like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and many of the different OWASP top 10 rules, and has some custom access control capabilities, and again, supports those services of Azure Front Door, Application Gateway, and CDN, the Content Delivery Network connections. And just to kind of cover Azure Front Door, just so it's in there, it's very similar to an Application Gateway, but this is more for global routing. So if you have global connections required, this will do very similar. It's an Application Gateway wrapped in a traffic manager, where it will route traffic to the closest endpoint for connectivity. So it's good for multi-site hosting, multiple countries that you're hosting websites and things. It'll route to the closest environment. Again, you can integrate it with the web application firewall, and again, it works at that HTTP level of traffic. ExpressRoute is your direct connection from your on-premises environment or from your hosting provider, your ISP, directly into Azure, rather than utilizing an IPsec gateway with a VPN gateway. You can utilize ExpressRoute and purchase and have some dedicated bandwidth, have a higher level of security within your connection to Azure. It's used for more high bandwidth intensive applications on premises that need to communicate with Azure than an IPsec tunnel is going to provide, as well as a higher level security for highly confidential type traffic streams. All right, let's do some more knowledge checking here. You are deploying the Azure Application Gateway and want to ensure incoming requests are checked for common security threats like cross-site scripting and crawlers. To address your concerns, what should you do? What can you add to an Azure Application Gateway for common security threats? Hopefully everybody here said install the WAF. Add web application firewall to that Azure Application Gateway. All right, next one. You're configuring a network security group. All of the following are default rules except. So now you know why I went into the portal to show you that last rule that I couldn't remember. So is it allow all virtual network inbound and outbound, allow Azure Load Balancer inbound, allow internet inbound, or allow internet outbound? It is allow. Oh, I've got the wrong one highlighted here. Allow internet outbound is correct. It should be allow internet inbound. My apologies there. Let me go fix that here quick. Highlighted the wrong one. Just before I forget and this one comes back to haunt me again. Yeah, it is allowing internet traffic inbound. We do not want to allow any internet traffic inbound by. Oh, that's why. Oh, never mind. That was the correct one. We don't want to do that, but they're asking for the one that is not the default because we do allow internet traffic outbound. Sorry, I interpreted the question. So yes, so all of these are default rules because those are things that we want to block or allow. We don't, and allowing, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm getting myself all wrapped up. It's a default rule is not to allow inbound internet traffic. If it said deny inbound internet traffic, that would be a correct one. We allow internet outbound, so I was right by this being corrected, being put wrong, and I've got it corrected now. So this is your correct answer. My apologies for getting confused there. Allowing internet inbound traffic is always denied. That is a deny rule by default. All right, let's move on. All right, endpoint protection. So how are we going to protect our endpoints? And this is important in what we're going to do as an organization to protect our, and when we're talking about endpoints in terms of Azure, we're talking, our databases, our virtual machines. Those are our endpoints, and what we're doing to protect those endpoints and how we're connecting to those. And that's where privileged access workstations come into play, where this is a separate dedicated device. So generally what a lot of organizations do, especially if you're a managed service provider, is they put a jump box in place that is that first level of access, and you access that, an attacker tries to access that, they then need to jump again to into that privileged workstation, and hopefully and that should have a different level of authentication than the jump box does, so that you can get to that, so that if you're authorized, you can get to that second tier. The attacker generally is not going to be able to perpetrate both of those levels, and that's why we put that jump box there as a layer of protection. Another way to provide a level of protection, though, is also remote access, is utilizing remote access management by blocking remote desktop protocol or SSH protocol at the internet basis, and then utilizing a Bastion host on a Bastion subnet to connect. It's very similar to kind of that jump box concept and that privileged access workstation, but the Bastion subnet is not a workstation per se. You're essentially utilizing the Azure portal to open up that RDP or SSH connection directly from the portal. So you really have to authenticate to the portal to get to that virtual machine, and then authenticate to that virtual machine. So you're within the Azure environment the entire time. So it provides a different level of protection rather than downloading an RDP session directly on your desktop. Once you close that session, that RDP token or that application that's opened on your desktop isn't there anymore. It's never installed to begin with. So the Bastion provides that, again, that layer of security to access that environment. When we are protecting our virtual machines within the Azure environment, we ultimately want to encrypt those virtual machines. We want to protect those virtual machines, and the way we want to do that is with Azure disk encryption. Disk encryption is different than what is done on storage accounts. We are encrypting doing encryption at the overall, both the operating system disk as well as the data disk. So we're doing essentially what we would do for a standalone device in Windows we're utilizing BitLocker, but because within a virtual environment we don't have access to that TPM kernel, we utilize Azure Disk Encryption to enable BitLocker on the environment, and those keys and secrets then go into Azure Key Vault, which we'll talk about Azure Key Vault here shortly. Within Linux, it's utilizing dmcrypt. So if you're familiar with the Linux environment, you should be familiar with dmcrypt as well. And those keys, again, can be utilized in terms of a customer stored key within Azure Key Vault, or utilize a customer managed environment as well, managed Key Vault. For Security Center, Security Center provides a variety of recommendations, and we'll talk more about Security Center when we get into operations and monitoring and management and in Objective 4. But we need to think about how what Security Center does overall around our platforms and our hosts. It does provide how we recommendations on how to better protect our endpoints, and that includes recognizing that, hey, we don't have disk encryption enabled, and it validates that. It validates what we need to do in terms of vulnerability and assessments and remediating of those vulnerabilities for our virtual machines and our databases, as well as doing a certain level of threat protection within there, just to identify where we might have threats within our organization by having RDP or SSH ports open and things of that nature. And it all has to do with then taking into account security best practices, and Microsoft has a ton of best practices from what they do within the global cybersecurity environment. They have a partnership with CIS, and through that partnership have a level of benchmarks, and those benchmarks are then monitored through the different monitoring capabilities and the services within Azure that then provide you with what those steps are, what needs to be done for your organization then to get you to that security baseline, and to feel that you are protected within your organization, and have the proper controls in place based on what is a best practice security baseline. All right, let's do another knowledge check here. Your organization has a security policy that prohibits exposing SSH ports to the outside world. You need to connect to an Azure Linux virtual machine to install software. What should you do? You want to prohibit exposing SSH ports to the outside world. So you do not want those to be open at all. So do you configure the Bastion service, configure a guest configuration on the virtual network, create a custom script extension, or work offline and then re-image the virtual machine? Configure the Bastion service. That is the answer, because you do not have to expose your ports. So we didn't really talk and haven't talked yet about just-in-time virtual machine access. That's one way to gain access to a virtual machine, but even for a short amount of time, in that just-in-time, you are exposing the SSH port to the outside world. With a Bastion, utilizing the Bastion service, you are never exposing those ports. You're utilizing that port to access that Linux virtual machine, but you're never exposing that port to the outside world. You are always within the Azure portal in your access. All right, let's get into a popular topic and where many organizations aspire to move to, and that's containers. Key things around containers is that they typically have a level of lightweight isolation. So that's, from a security standpoint, a good thing that they are isolated. They do run on an operating system. It is compute services. So they aren't any different than a virtual machine, except for the fact that from a developer standpoint and a security standpoint, you really don't work at the host OS or infrastructure layer at all. You work a layer above at an application layer, really with utilizing Docker as in a lot of cases, utilizing Docker as your orchestration service, or you could use something such as Azure Kubernetes. Key thing around containers, it also has persistent storage. It's highly fault tolerant. So if a container fails, a node fails, you can very easily start a new node and put your application to be up and running very quickly. So from a security resiliency standpoint, containers are very easy to, or very nice to utilize and helpful to utilize from, because they don't take a long time to like rebuild if one breaks. And from a security standpoint, key things that you need to worry about here within container services is DDoS attacks, which hopefully Microsoft has taken care of for you. But you might have also poisoned images. Your registry might get hacked, and something may be compromised within there. So it's important to have a chain of custody and a workflow on how those images are reviewed and approved, having proper API reviews, make sure that there's no API security issues that might cause a container to be breached. Principles of least privilege is obviously important across all services, to not elevate privileges and allow people to gain a level of access to a container that might be compromised. Whitelist files that the container can access, so make sure you're whitelisting where the containers need to access, and that avoids the need for those elevated privileges potentially. Maintain your network segmentation. Don't go across different networks that you don't have to, and then again, constant monitoring and logging different activities and looking for anomalies is always important. The container registry, like I said, is the build and the storing of images. It's essentially the file service and the shelf, as you see on this slide, that you keep all of your container images on, where you would grab those from the registry if a node fails to rebuild another node. And utilizes different interfaces such as Docker or Azure CLI to do those connections. And again, you can utilize the role-based access control for who has access to those container registries, and can automate processes with DevOps. A couple things to know about authentication around the container registry. Again, generally you can utilize for identity for Azure Active Directory. You can utilize your service principals or user services, and you can then use read, contributor, and owner type role-based access for individual identities. Generally, those are utilized for specific tasks, such as developers and testers being able to access. And then admin is disabled by default. You don't, and again, that goes around that avoiding the level of privileged access. Having a full admin user is probably not the best bet. You need to utilize these other capabilities first before you give somebody full admin rights. Kubernetes service is Azure's basis of Kubernetes. It's another level of container service, different from Azure Container Services, where this is more of an isolated single application type service. Kubernetes is more of an orchestrator of multiple automated and scaled workloads. It's a fully managed platform within the Azure environment. Again, utilizes role-based access control or Azure Active Directory, and provides a lot of dynamic scaling capabilities and automation. The architecture here is there's two different management layers that we need to understand from a security engineer standpoint, and that is we have the cluster master, and then we have the different nodes. And the cluster master is really Azure managed level, and then the customer from a customer level, you manage the node level. So Azure Managed Nodes are those core levels of services and the core orchestration that you can do some configuration in, but you really don't manage, in terms of setting up the scheduler and things of that nature. But the customer managed nodes are those virtual machines then that run your workloads, which you get, again, have the access to that very similarly as to you would for a typical virtual machine or a compute service. We have our services over here on the left here for our code and how we're taking that code and building that registry then that goes into that cluster. And that's really what we're seeing over on the left side here is our workflow. And having all of this and having all the APIs and all those connections properly configured from a security standpoint and an authentication standpoint is extremely important. And how does how traffic flows? You can generally, from a node standpoint, we can have direct traffic all the way down to the pod. For non-direct traffic, we can utilize a load balancer in front of the AKS node. So you could put that load balancer, which is a relatively unsmart device, in front of the AKS nodes without exposing them to the internet. And traffic goes then to public traffic, then goes to the load balancer and then can direct the traffic. And just to reinforce how Azure Active Directory works with the authentication, as we said, the Azure environment and Microsoft manages that cluster master environment, but that authentication for Azure Active Directory and those credentials are verified through that API server within that cluster master. And then that allows then the access to the Kubernetes service and to those nodes for creating your nodes, for setting up your containers, and for communicating and for working within those environments. All right, let's go over some more knowledge checks. You are using Azure Kubernetes service and need to control the flow of traffic between pods and block traffic directly to the backend application. What should you do? This one, you create a AKS network policy. So you can set up a specific policy. And if we go back a couple slides here, we can see, we can set that internal traffic access, and we can set up the different ways that we're going to set up that networking within here, and how those pods are connected. So you're setting up different policies on how this traffic, each one of these might be how the policy on how we're going to direct the traffic based on what type of traffic it is. All right, objective number 3, data and application security. So first and foremost, we hit on Key Vault, and we talked about Key Vault a little bit when we were talking about Azure Disk Encryption. Azure Key Vault provides tokens and passwords and certificate capabilities, API keys and other secrets. It's not utilized for user passwords and user keys and user authentication. It's specifically for those tokens, passwords, and certificates around different services within the Azure environment. It can also handle your private and public SSL TLS type certificates. And with a premium license, you can also utilize your own HSM on premises and synchronize those on premises HSM keys, HSM secrets to the Azure Key Vault as well. And this kind of shows you the two different ways for authentication and authorization in Azure Key Vault. And depending on where we're talking about within the Key Vault is how we're going to authenticate. And you can see here within the management plane for creating Key Vaults and retrieving properties and updating access policies, we're going to use role-based access control. But at the data plane, where we're actually adding and working with the keys at the key level, we have key vault access policies. So keep that in mind to understand how you authenticate with the Azure Key Vault at a level. At the management plane level, which is really at the Azure portal type level, is role-based access control. But when you get into that level of where now working with the keys and the secrets, you have to have a Key Vault access policy. It's specific to that service. One of the key differentiators around Azure Key Vault is how it can manage certificates as well. So it handles those keys and those secrets that Microsoft can manage as well, but you want to have that separation of duties, which is the key piece around Key Vault and why you would move to Key Vault. But you also have the capability and need to manage keys a little bit differently in terms of your certificates and how you're accessing and create and utilizing certificates for your certificate authority for your websites and things of that nature. And you can utilize those certificate authority certificates as well as those self-signed certificates, and we can automatically renew those, so we can handle the life cycle of those certificates within Azure Key Vault, which is very helpful. And as I stated, Key Vault's really used as a separation of duties for our securing our environment, where where many services have keys for our encryption keys that Microsoft manages. We may want to remove that from being something that's exposed within the service in Microsoft and move it to Azure Key Vault to, again, separate those duties. And we can do that by moving that to that customer managed key type setup. And here we kind of take that Azure key account, that encryption key that's wrapped with the account, and we then push it then to and we're utilizing that in our Key Vault. Here, we're also can take that to an on-premises Key Vault with the HSM customer managed key on-premises, and also synchronize that to the Azure environment and to the Key Vault, and those two then synchronize themselves. And Azure Key Vault holds those keys, but those keys are still managed on-premises, so a little bit different there. All right. Which of the following should not be stored in Azure Key Vault? What are the differences between these items? Select one. All right, and the answer here is identity management. We have our keys, which are really used for our security, our encryption, to encrypt and unencrypt our data. Ultimately, secrets management is utilizing secrets that are utilized for our applications to communicate with each other. Our certificates are what's allowing access to our encrypted access to our websites for users. Identity management is really our authentication of our users, and that falls outside of the scope of Azure Key Vault, as we said. Just a quick look here at the Microsoft Identity Platform and how this works. We have our portal, we have our authentication library, we have our identity, our endpoint platform, then we have our different accounts. So utilizing the different API, the Graph API within Microsoft, we can utilize all of these accounts here at the bottom for authenticating into our Azure or Microsoft 365 resources to a degree, or third-party resources and applications within our environment. If you go to an application and it asks you for your Microsoft account, or it asks you for Facebook or Google or LinkedIn, that's what this is doing, and this is what it's showing, that how that Graph API then can help you with that connection, utilizing multiple different types of identities. And this is helpful from a business to consumer type level, or even a business to business type level, where you have a partner organization that already has an Azure Active Directory identity that needs access, that you want to give access to your environment as well. So you could invite them as a guest on your environment, and they can use their own work identity as well. And here's just a scenario here where an API might work with a service principal. We've talked about service principals a little bit, and one application connects to another application, and it's authenticated through a token or a secret even could be utilized within the Azure Key Vault environment to authenticate and have this application access to another application. We have the capability within Azure to register applications within the Azure Active Directory environment and to allow an application for a third party or a on-premises application to be able to utilize Azure Active Directory resources. It must be registered, and that's what app registration is. And you can connect that and register that based on the URL of the web and connect it that way, and then set up different access means. If it's an intranet site, you might only want to allow people within your own organization to access it. If it's a public website, you'll allow them to use different accounts as well. And again, we're still talking about identity, even though we're not in the identity objective area. Again, many of these all come down to identity. And you can see here that managed identity has a whole bunch of different ways in which Azure Active Directory plays a role to authenticate to different services. And these identities are system and user assigned, and so we can assign different users those services and create those identities, create those identity principles, and then have those tokens and those capabilities for the role-based access control to kick into place for access to our services within the Azure environment. We also have the capability for system assigned type properties, which is where we come down to a request token that takes place around service principals for one resource to access another. Those are more service system-based assigned identities. All right. What type of managed service identities can you create? Select two. Hopefully you guys hit this one quick because we just talked about it. And it's system assigned and user assigned. Okay, let's talk about data a little bit. So data sovereignty, we talked about this a little bit when I hit on policies. What we want to make sure that we do is we want to maintain compliance to local laws in terms of data, and that could be not leaving that data not leaving that particular geographic region. And so we want to make sure that we're governing that properly and that we're isolating physically that data from where we're not allowed to have that leave. So that provides then what we need to do in terms of where that data resides and how we're going to provide that level of protection and replication of that data within that specific geography for proper sovereignty. And we can do certain things around storage accounts to maintain that. So creating storage accounts in specific regions and how then we're going to then authorize and to authenticate to those is different based on the storage account and what type of storage account it is. Within a storage account, we have multiple types of storage types. We have blobs, files, we have tables, and we have queues. We're not going to talk about tables and queues, and it's outside of the scope of this exam. We talk about it more when you do like the Azure admin exam. But understanding how we authenticate and utilize authentication within these is very important. Blobs have multiple types of authentication. We have storage account, we have shared keys, we have shared access signatures, It does support Azure Active Directory for authentication, and we can also make it anonymous, where no authentication is required. Not going to generally do that unless maybe it's a image full container for images for our website. Otherwise, you generally use one of these. Azure Files is the SMB. It emulates a file server within Azure on a storage account. You can use a storage account shared key again. With Active Directory domain services, we can utilize Azure Active Directory. So we have to turn on Azure Active Directory domain services and make it look more like an Active Directory domain than Azure Active Directory for Azure Files to work. That's again because of the SMB type protocol. It acts like a file server on premises, so it needs something similar. It needs similar authentication to an Active Directory server. It does. It's in preview for Active Directory on premises when it's synced with Azure Active Directory. Again, there's no anonymous with Azure Files, and Azure Files with a REST API does also support shared access signature. It does not with the SMB type capability. Shared access signatures are important to look at and to understand, and they give you a level of rights and tell you what those rights are at the and for how long you have those rights. So if you need to share a file to somebody within a storage account, you can very easily do that for a limited amount of time utilizing a shared access signature. And it's important within the exam to understand how to break apart these shared access signatures. And if I was to go in here and go to a storage account here, I can go down to my container and find a container here. And if I want to select this, and I can generate a shared access signature. And if I look here and share it for a little bit of time here, I could share directly from my IP address if I wanted to, and generate that URL. It provides me then with this dedicated URL. It's got my web address of my storage account, and then it gives me some specific things. I created only read-only permissions, so I can see storage permission here. And let me zoom in a little bit here. I have a start time here. Let me copy it to clipboard, actually. This will be more helpful. Let me open a notepad here quick. All right, this makes it easier. So if I zoom in on this here, you can see I have the file name, I have it's read-only, that my start time is here. This is like UTC time, it's not the actual time that I'm in my time zone. It has an end time here. It has that I'm requiring HTTPS. And then it has like when I saved it, when I created it. And then it has on the end, it has then my key for that. So important to know how to break it down. It's very easy. Like we have the SP for storage permission. We have storage, we have the start, we have the end, and that's how we can identify when we're going to have access to those services. Again, Azure Storage Authentication, we can, again, that's available for Blob and Q Storage, and you have different built-in roles again, data owner, data contributor, data reader, and it's a two-step process of authenticating with the token and then the token return for authorization. Storage service encryption is built into the Azure storage service. By default, every piece of data within the storage account is encrypted by default with 2256-bit AES. and it's transparent to all users. And again, you can set that encryption to Microsoft managed keys, which is what we were hearing. Those keys were all in there within the storage account, or we can push that to customer managed keys to a key vault or to a on-premises HSM. And then we have retention policies for legal reasons or for tax purposes. We can set up different retention policies, set up a life cycle for where we're going to take those services and move them to to archive storage and retain those, and it supports logging those and auditing those. All right, company has both a development and a production environment. The development environment needs time-limited access to storage. The production environment needs user-restricted access to storage resources. You need to configure storage access to meet the requirements. What should you do? Each answer presents part of the solution, so select two. So we need time-limited access to storage for the development, and we need unrestricted access to the storage resources for production. So what are we going to put into place here? Two services here. All right, we're going to use a shared access signature for the development because that's time-based. We need unrestricted access, so we're going to use those access keys for the production apps. That's the best answer here for production. As we continue down the data and databases, we need to talk now about SQL, SQL database authentication, and this is we have different capabilities within here, as well as we did with storage accounts. Generally, from a Azure Active Directory standpoint, we have our Active Directory database administrator. And at the database level, we generally have a SQL database administrator. So keep that in mind. That you utilize different identities at different levels. You can also, you also can have a level at the database inside the database level. When you go into the actual database, you can utilize your Azure credentials to configure and to authenticate to your database and to work in your database as this SQL database administrator. Databases also have firewall capabilities built into themselves. If you're utilizing the platform services, you can create database level firewall rules and utilize those rather than utilizing like an Azure firewall. You can get more granular at the database level to provide different different client IP address routes or different Azure services and provide them access within the specific service that maybe you only need certain services to have access to the database, and you can get granular and utilize the firewall to do that. And then the server level firewall rules are part of that for the subnet at the database, for the database level, for the client at the client level. For database auditing, we have capabilities to audit those databases. We can do assessments, we can do vulnerability assessments within the databases to configure those policies and configure the different destinations and things of that nature as well. We can have, again, lots of capabilities within the SQL environment to understand and to think about. It's important to really study and look at the Microsoft docs around SQL database and that platform service, because we have so many capabilities for protecting data within the service that it's hard to keep track of, and we can't, in the short time we have to spend here in this exam cram, we don't really get to it. But data discovery and classification is built into SQL database, and it can scan your environment and look for certain things like certain things that fall into GDPR, or finding credit card numbers, social security numbers, and things of that nature. You can review that information and then discover and classify that information automatically. as well as, again, vulnerability assessments. You can look at those and do a vulnerability assessment that then scans those databases, looks for vulnerabilities, and then rates those vulnerabilities based on a high, medium, or low risk level, and gives you recommendations to fix those potential risks and potential vulnerabilities before they become threats and become incidents. And here are some things that it looks at in terms of threat protection, and what it's assessing in terms of those vulnerability assessments is how vulnerable, and what threats you might see in terms of SQL injection, data exfiltration, unsafe action, brute force attacks, and then anomalous client logins is all part of the anomalous login piece is something that Microsoft really looks at in terms of identity across all of its services, that utilizes those machine learning capabilities that are built into Microsoft. Dynamic data masking is another capability for within a SQL database to review and to understand, again, that sensitive information in there, and then by default masking that information to users that don't have access to that information. We can have administrators are excluded from that, but any other user, we can set a role-based access on whether that information is going to be masked or not. Transparent data encryption is one of the two types of encryption within SQL database. Transparent data encryption is very similar to storage service encryption. It is encryption of the data at rest. It is on by default within when you turn on a SQL server and create a SQL database, but it is is a little bit different from the storage service. We have storage service encryption, so it's important to understand the different levels of encryption and what service they are tied to. Transparent data encryption is data at rest for SQL databases. Storage service encryption is data at rest for a storage account. Azure disk encryption is encryption of a virtual machine, and always encrypted is encryption of SQL for data that is in transit. It is utilizing encryption at the application level so that data is always encrypted throughout its life cycle and throughout its access cycle. So data in transit and at use, that's always encrypted at the SQL database. So let's do another knowledge check here. Your organization provides a help desk for its customers. Service representatives need to identify callers using the last 4 numbers of their credit card. You need to ensure that the complete credit card number is not fully exposed to these service representatives. Which of the following features do you implement? Is it always encrypted, data classification, dynamic data masking, or transparent data encryption? Here we're looking at dynamic data masking. We're obscuring and masking the everything but the last 4 digits of that credit card number. Oh, forgot the non-answer question here. Your organization auditors need to be assured that sensitive database data always remains encrypted at rest, in transit, and in use. You assure the auditors that it is being done because you have configured which feature, and we can see already that the answer is always encrypted. All right, last section. Let's power through here. All right. So in here, in this section, we're talking about security operations. So we're going to talk about the different services then, and this is really the shortest section in terms of when we teach the course. So this shouldn't take too long to just kind of get it at a high level. Azure Monitor is really what comes down as the base level and feature and functionality of all of this. Azure Monitor is that consolidation point for all the services, whether it's Security Center or any type of SIM tool. It collects all of those metrics and logs, and then can feed that into different services and different tools within the Azure Monitor ecosystem, such as application insights, in the containers, the dashboards, Power BI workbooks, analyzing through just specific metrics explored within Azure Monitor, or running Kusto queries in log analytics, responding to alerts and auto scaling can be done within Azure Monitor through alerts and action groups, and it can be integrated with different workflows such as event hubs and logic apps and different APIs as well. And so the two things, as I pointed out, were metrics and logs. Metrics are specific numeric values on how systems are performing at a point in time, and then logs are different kinds of telemetry activities, such as events and traces and performance data that's collected, activity that's happening on services and things of that nature. And then log analytics is a way then within Azure Monitor you can move to log analytics to then query those metrics and logs, specifically the logs, and run different queries on how to analyze those results, and then present those results, or export those results, present those results in a dashboard or a graphical format, take it to Power BI for a much more executive level look, as well as creating different alerts based on those queries to continue to look for specific events that are taking place. And the nice thing about Azure Monitor and log analytics is that it can be utilized not just within the Azure environment, but it can be utilized for multiple connected sources by utilizing the Azure Monitor agent on virtual machines within other clouds, virtual machines on premises, or utilizing it with a system center operations management server. So you can have different data collected for Windows and Linux machines, as well as Azure storage environments, and send that all in through Azure Monitor and query that information within log analytics. We talked about alerts, and built in within Azure Monitor, we can create different alerts as a workflow for our help desk type staff or our security staff for if it's a severity of a security type alert, we can send that in to our security staff, and they can respond to it and investigate it. If it has to do with performance of a virtual machine, there can be an alert to the help desk staff or the server, the virtual machine management contributor staff, and as well as maybe a scaling out of those virtual machines if they're on a scale set, or rebooting those virtual machines through a different through a run book or automation script. So lots of things that you can do with the Azure Monitor alerts. And we can also do different diagnostic logging and utilize that for different OSs and and send that to storage accounts or event hubs, and again log analytics as well to query. And this is really the settings that you would put into place when you're within your virtual machine or your virtual machine agent. Within your virtual machine agent to connect to those resources. All right. Question here: data collected by Azure Monitor fits into which two fundamental categories? What is the differences in those types of data? And the answer here is logs and metrics. The metrics are the performance snapshot at a point in time. Logs are actually events and telemetry. So events actually fit under the logs. So that's why that's what is there. You can query log analytics workspaces with which of the following? And the answer here is Kusto query language. That is your log analytics language. All right. We're getting now into how we're going to now, what can we do from an operational standpoint, from a security standpoint. And the important thing to look at here is the cyber kill chain. And when we think about how attacks take place, we look at this in an 8-step process. We have reconnaissance and intrusion, exploitation, privilege access, and then then they're going to use that privileged access to move around your environment. They're then going to try and cover their tracks with obfuscation and anti-forensics. Then they might try some data denial of service type attack. Ultimately, they're going to try and exfiltrate. They're going to try and take over something or remove something, some sort of level of theft. And Security Center is designed around this kill chain. And so it's important as we talk about Security Center to think about that. What Security Center does is it helps to prevent, detect, and respond. It can be utilized as a security status monitor environment. That's your central hub for both Azure as well as different environments. Again, utilizing that Azure Monitor agent on virtual machines in different environments can feed that information into Azure Security Center. And there's two tiers. It's actually Defender Off and Defender On now, which is the free and the standard. But those are ultimately what they are. The two ways that they're seen is with both types of subscriptions, you get your secure score and can utilize that secure score to give you a snapshot to how you look based on best practices, and you can then take recommendations to increase that score and get to a better level. Just-in-time virtual machine access is important to understand here, and this comes along with the Defender On type service, or what used to be the standard service, and it recommends, like we were talking about with Bastion Host and connecting in there, the just-in-time virtual machine access gives you kind of that gives you RDP access for a limited amount of time, generally up to 3 hours, and you can specify a specific IP range so only you can utilize that port and not expose it to the internet. So your Azure Security Center dashboard presents a secure score. How would you describe that score? Score is calculation. I'm not going to read all these. I'll pause and we can look at these. You can pause the video if you're watching later, but is it based on healthy resources versus total resources? Is it recommendations made against your monitored resources? Is it machine learning based on predictions? Or is it changes in premium features that are purchased? It's the first one. It's healthy resources versus total resources. So those that are viewed as healthy from a security standpoint, from a best practice standpoint, and how those are utilized within your environment is what that is. Your organization is working with an outside agency that needs to access a virtual machine. They're concerned about brute force login attacks targeted at the virtual machine management ports. Which of the following can be used to open the management ports for a defined time range? And since this is an outside agency, we don't want to give them access to our Azure portal. So that kind of takes Bastion service out of there. And really the answer here is that just-in-time virtual machine access. Azure Sentinel. So Azure Sentinel is a SIEM and a SOAR, which is a security information event management system and a security orchestration automated response system put together. It is Microsoft's cloud-based SIEM solution, and it's utilized to collect, detect, investigate, and respond to potential threats within your environment. So it provides multiple services around data connectors, and these data connectors are both within the Azure and Microsoft environment, as well as external clouds like AWS, as well as external solutions and services such as Barracuda, F5, and the like. It works with other solutions as well for different log streaming as well. If the solutions aren't there, we can connect different syslogs to services as well. Workbooks are then a second level to that, where once we have a data connected, we have different workbooks that also connect to our services, and then we can utilize those workbooks to analyze trends and find anomalous behaviors that are taking place. And we can then, based on certain anomalous behavior, create incidents that at different levels of severity, and then take those incidents and build and then remediate and assign those to different to different people to investigate and to find out what's going on with that environment. Playbooks can then also be used for alerting. Like I said, if we get an alert from Security Center through Azure Sentinel, we can send an email to alert people that, hey, we have an incident that needs to be evaluated, and we can utilize Logic App Designer to create those. Utilizing log analytics and Custo queries, there are a multitude of different hunting queries that are built in to, again, query and analyze and then run Jupyter notebooks and integrate with Python, that are integrated with Python language to again, investigate those threats and to hunt on those threats. All right, you're explaining what an Azure Sentinel playbook is and how it can be used. You cover all of the following except one. The playbook is a collection of procedures that can be run in response to an alert. Playbook can help automate and orchestrate an incident response. Azure Sentinel playbook can be run manually or set to run automatically with specific alerts that are triggered. Or a Sentinel playbook can be created to handle several subscriptions at once. You cover all of the following except. Sentinel playbook cannot handle more than one subscription, so that is the exception of what a playbook is here on this question. All right, you are an investigator who wants to be proactive about looking for security threats. You have read about Sentinel's hunting capabilities and notebooks. What is an Azure Sentinel notebook? The built-in query to provide you with an entry point. Is a saved item you can come back to create an incident. It's a step-by-step playbook where you can walk through the steps of investigation, or it is a table you can query. It is a step-by-step playbook. So a notebook is a step-by-step playbook that you can walk through for investigating and hunting. All right, that gets us to the end of this exam cram. We went through a lot here in a couple hours here. We talked about different challenges around security, and we went through all of the objective areas and took an overview of the exam and those objective areas. At a high level, I recommend that if you have not attended the AZ-500 class, that you do, or visit the AZ-500 learning path on Skill Me Up Academy and review the Microsoft Learn content and do some of the labs in that. But overall, you need to understand these four areas of identity and access, platform protection, data and application security, and security operations if you're going to sit for the AZ-500 exam. Once you feel comfortable with that, I hope to hear that you pass the exam and hear about it on social media and see. Love to see people passing this exam. I enjoy this exam. I enjoy the topics around security, and I hope you enjoyed this exam cram. Thank you very much. I'm Dwayne Natwick. Thank you for attending this certification talk, and have a great day.